Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we've got some seriously dark stuff to unpack. You shared some articles and a book excerpt about this guy, Charles Schmid. Ever heard of him?
You might not recognize the name right away, but Schmid's story was like a snapshot of everything kind of unsettling about 1960s America. We're talking teenage rebellion, this obsession with celebrity, and really this much darker side to the American dream.
Okay, so we're diving into the Pied Piper of Tucson. Let's start with his background. Born in 42, adopted, seemingly had it all. So how did things go so wrong?
That's the question, isn't it? What makes this case so fascinating? Schmid's parents owned a nursing home. So on the surface, pretty privileged upbringing. But the sources you shared, there's this really strained relationship with his father, almost like a constant battle for approval.
So it's that classic contrast, outwardly successful, charming, even a star athlete. But underneath it all, there's trouble brewing. Drops out of school, gets involved in petty theft. It's like he's living a double life.
Exactly. And that tension between appearance and reality, that's key to understanding Schmid. This guy was obsessed with crafting a persona, almost like a character he was playing. He'd stuff his boots to appear taller, wear makeup, even mimic Elvis's lip curl.
Wait, hold on. He studded his boots. That's some serious commitment to an image. But it wasn't just vanity, right? This all ties into the whole Pied Piper persona he cultivated.
Right. Think about the Pied Piper story, luring children away from their homes. And that's exactly what Schmid did with his teenage followers. This wasn't just a random nickname. It was a carefully constructed identity. Playing on his charisma, that rebellious streak, and this air of danger he projected.
It's chilling how deliberate it all seems. So how did he use this persona to manipulate the teens around him? What were they drawn to?
He gave them what they craved, a sense of belonging. Escape Schmid was older, had his own place, even got a monthly allowance from his parents. To teenagers stuck in what they saw as this restrictive, boring world, he represented freedom, excitement.
And that made them vulnerable to his influence.
Absolutely. Teenage years are all about figuring out who you are, worth you fit in. These kids were looking for acceptance, a group to call their own. They didn't see the darkness lurking beneath the surface.
And that brings us to May 1964 and his first known victim, Eileen Rowe. The sources mention that Schmid actually boasted about wanting to kill a girl to his girlfriend and a friend.
Yeah, that premeditation is one of the things that makes this case so disturbing. It wasn't a crime of passion. This was a calculated decision. They knew Eileen's mother worked nights, so they went to her house, lured her out to the desert under false pretenses.
And his girlfriend Mary French was part of this?
Yes, Schmid made her do the convincing preying on Eileen's insecurities to get her to come along. Once they were in the desert, Schmid tied Eileen up and raped her. He even told his friend John Saunders to do the same. But Saunders refused.
Wow. To be in that situation knowing what Schmid was capable of, that must have been terrifying for Saunders. What was going through his mind?
We can only imagine the psychological pressure, the fear he was experiencing. Sadly, it didn't stop the tragedy. Schmid brutally murdered Eileen, while Saunders and French were away from the scene. Later, all three helped bury her body.
This raises so many questions about complicity. Saunders was clearly disturbed by what was happening, yet he still participated in the cover-up. What does that say about the power dynamics within Schmid's circle?
It's a question worth considering. Were these teenagers so enthralled by Schmid that they were willing to overlook his horrific actions? Or were they simply too afraid to defy him? This case, it really forces us to examine the complexities of group dynamics and the dark side of peer pressure.
The sources say that Eileen's refusal to have sex with Schmid and his friends was the motive. It's just horrifying that a young life was snuffed out over something so trivial.
It speaks to a disturbing sense of entitlement and control. It wasn't enough for Schmid to have Eileen's company. He demanded complete obedience. And when she dared to defy him, the consequences were fatal.
It's a terrifying glimpse into the mind of a killer. And unfortunately, this was only the beginning of Schmid's reign of terror. A few months later, a troubled teen named Gretchen Fritz enters the picture.
Gretchen was from a wealthy family, and like many teenagers of that era, she was rebellious. Searching for an escape from her seemingly perfect life, she became completely fixated on Schmid, and their relationship quickly spiraled into a dangerous codependency.
Codependency? What do you mean by that?
Codependency. It's a type of dysfunctional relationship where one person relies excessively on the other for validation and a sense of identity. In this case, Gretchen was obsessed with Schmid, constantly seeking his approval, while Schmid used her infatuation to maintain control.
So they're both damaged individuals feeding off each other's darkness.
Precisely, Gretchen was possessive and jealous, terrified that Schmid would leave her. And Schmid, in turn, was terrified of Gretchen exposing his secrets, particularly after she stole his diary.
His diary? What was in it that he was so afraid of?
It detailed the murder of Eileen Rowe. And it didn't stop there. Schmid had also written about the alleged shooting of another teenager, No wonder he was desperate to keep Gretchen quiet.
So they were locked in this toxic dance of obsession and fear, each holding a piece of the other's dark past. Where does this dangerous dynamic lead them?
To a horrifying climax that would seal their fates and shock the nation. But before we delve into that, let's take a closer look at the social and cultural forces that might have contributed to Schmid's twisted worldview. You mentioned the social and cultural forces at play. This was the 1960s, right? A time of huge upheaval in America. How do you think that context shaped Schmid and his appeal to these teens?
Well, everything was being questioned: authority, traditional values. You had the rise of countercultural movements, rock and roll, the sense of rebellion in the air. It was fertile ground for someone like Schmid to thrive.
It's interesting you say thrive because Schmid really played into that anti-establishment sentiment. He represented a rejection of the status quo, which was incredibly seductive to teenagers who felt stifled by the expectations of their parents and society.
Right. It's like the whole James Dean rebel without a cause image, but taken to a terrifying extreme.
Exactly. Schmid was charismatic, he was good-whiffing, he had this air of danger, and he offered these kids a sense of belonging, a community where they felt understood and accepted.
Except that community was built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. Did anyone ever try to stand up to him? To challenge his authority?
There were moments of doubt, even resistance. Remember John Saunders, the friend who refused to participate in Aline's rape. He was clearly conflicted, torn between his loyalty to Schmid and his own moral compass.
But even Saunders helped bury Aline's body. It makes you wonder what kind of hold Schmidt had over these kids that they were willing to be complicit in such a horrific act.
That's where the psychology of cults becomes relevant. Schmid created an environment where questioning his authority was discouraged, where loyalty was paramount. He isolated his followers from their families and friends, making them dependent on him for approval and validation.
So it wasn't just charm, it was calculated manipulation.
Absolutely, Schmid understood the power of group dynamics. He created an us versus them mentality, portraying himself and his followers as outsiders, rebels, fighting against a hypocritical and oppressive society.
And that narrative, combined with his charisma and the social climate of the time, was enough to draw these kids into his web of darkness.
It's a complex mix of factors. We can't ignore the individual vulnerabilities of the teenagers involved, their desire for acceptance and belonging. But Schmid was a master manipulator who exploited those vulnerabilities, preying on their insecurities and twisting their youthful idealism to suit his own twisted purposes.
Speaking of manipulation, let's talk about what happened with Gretchen and her younger sister Wendy. This is where Schmid's brutality escalates to a whole new level.
The sources you shared suggest that Gretchen, despite her obsession with Schmid, was also terrified of him. She knew about his dark secrets, and that knowledge put her in a precarious position.
She was like a ticking time bomb, and Schmid knew it.
Exactly. In August 1965, Schmid decided to eliminate the threat. He lured Gretchen and Wendy to the desert under the pretense of a romantic outing.
And he killed both of them. What about Wendy? She was just a child. She couldn't have posed any real danger to him.
That's what makes Wendy's murder so particularly disturbing. It says that Schmid's violence was escalating, that he was losing control. He wasn't just eliminating a threat. He was indulging in a horrific act of power and cruelty.
It's chilling to think about what those girls went through in their final moments. Did anyone suspect Schmid? Was there any investigation at the time?
There were rumors, suspicions, but nothing concrete. Schmid was careful. He planned his crimes meticulously, and he relied on the silence of his followers to protect him. But there was one person who couldn't live with the guilt: Richard Bruns.
Bruns is a fascinating character. He was part of Schmidt's inner circle involved in the cover-up of Aline's murder. But something changed for him, didn't it?
It seems the weight of his complicity became too much to bear. Bruns fled to Ohio seeking refuge with his grandparents. While he was there, he confided in them, revealing the truth about Schmid's crimes.
So it was Bruns who ultimately brought Schmid down.
Yes, tormented by guilt and fear, he returned to Tucson and informed the police. His testimony was crucial in securing Schmid's arrest and bringing an end to his reign of terror.
Bruns's decision to turn against Schmid raises an important question. What was it about him that allowed him to break free from the Pied Piper spell while others remained loyal even in the face of overwhelming evidence?
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of conscience to overcome fear and manipulation. Bruns's journey highlights the fact that even in the darkest of situations, there's always hope for redemption, for choosing the path of righteousness over blind loyalty.
It's a glimmer of light in a very dark story. But Schmid's story doesn't end with his arrest. In fact, his trial becomes a media sensation, with reporters from all over the country flocking to Tucson to cover the case.
This is where the social fascination with true crime really comes into play. Schmid's trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a public spectacle, a morality play that captured the nation's attention.
It's like he became a celebrity, his evil somehow amplified by the media coverage. Did he revel in the attention?
It's hard to say for sure, but he certainly played the part of the charming rogue, the misunderstood rebel. This was a man who craved attention, who built his identity around being different, being noticed. The trial gave him a platform unlike any he'd ever experienced before.
And the verdict? Was justice served?
In 1966, Schmid was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. But there's a twist.
Of course there is. This is Charles Schmid we're talking about. Nothing is ever straightforward.
Right. Arizona temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1971, so Schmid's sentence was commuted to 50 years in prison. The possibility of him being released one day sent shockwaves through the community and beyond.
I can only imagine the fear and outrage that caused. So what happened to Schmid behind bars? Did he finally confront the gravity of his actions, or did he remain the manipulative, charismatic figure he'd always been?
That's a question we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. We'll delve into Schmid's life in prison, his multiple escape attempts, and his ultimately violent end. It's a story that reveals another layer of his complex and disturbing personality.
So we left off with Schmid in prison, his death sentence commuted. You mentioned he tried to escape multiple times. What was driving that? Was it just a fear of being locked up or something deeper?
It's fascinating to consider, right? Here's a guy who'd spent his whole life manipulating others, craving control. Prison strips all that away. So maybe the escape attempts were about regaining some sense of power, proving he couldn't be contained.
That makes sense given his personality, but it also shows a complete lack of remorse, right? Like he never accepted responsibility for what he did.
Exactly. And during one of these escape attempts in 1972, he briefly took hostages. That detail really stuck with me. It wasn't enough to just break free. He had to inflict fear, exert control over others, even in that desperate situation.
It suggests a deeply ingrained need for dominance, almost like violence was his default response to any challenge.
Yeah, that's a tilling thought, but it seems to fit with what we've learned about Schmid. But his story, it doesn't end with a daring escape. He was caught, and in 1975, he met a violent end at the hands of his fellow inmates.
It's almost a Shakespearean twist of fate, the killer becoming the victim. What do we know about the circumstances of his death?
The details are murky, but it seems he was stabbed multiple times in a prison fight. Some speculate it was revenge, maybe orchestrated by inmates who'd grown tired of his manipulative ways.
So he finally pushed too far, alienated even the hardened criminals he was surrounded by.
It's possible prison has its own code of conduct, a hierarchy of power. Schmid, even behind bars, probably couldn't resist trying to manipulate that system. And it seems it ultimately backfired.
His death, it's almost an anticlimax to this whole saga. You'd think someone like Schmid would go out in a blaze of glory, not a brutal stabbing in a prison yard.
It's certainly not the ending you'd expect for a figure who'd become so mythologized. But maybe that's the point. Stripping away the sensationalism, the media hype, we're left with a stark reminder of the banality of evil.
Right. It's easy to get caught up in the charisma, the manipulation, but ultimately, Schmid's life and death were a testament to the destructive power of unchecked ego and a complete lack of empathy.
It's a powerful lesson and one that's still relevant today. We see echoes of Schmid's story in modern-day cult leaders and abusers who charm and manipulate their victims. It's a reminder to be vigilant, to question authority, to trust our gut instincts when something feels wrong.
Before we wrap up, there's one more aspect I wanted to touch on. The sources mention that Schmid considered himself a poet and a writer. Did his art offer any insights into his personality, or was it just another form of manipulation?
That's a question that's been debated for years. Some see his writing as evidence of a tortured soul, someone grappling with the weight of his actions even if he couldn't fully articulate it. Others see it as pure narcissism, a way to cast himself as a tragic hero, misunderstood and wrongly accused.
It's almost impossible to separate the art from the artist in a case like this. Every word, every image is tainted by the knowledge of his crimes.
Exactly. And that's the challenge we face when trying to understand someone like Schmid. There are no easy answers, no neat psychological profiles that can fully explain the darkness that drove him. We're left with fragments, glimpses into a disturbed mind, and the unsettling realization that evil can wear many masks.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, albeit disturbing. We've gone from Schmid's seemingly idyllic childhood to his descent into darkness, exploring the psychological complexities, the social context, and the ultimately tragic consequences of his actions.
It's been a journey into the heart of a true crime mystery, a reminder that beneath the surface of charm and charisma, there could be a profound capacity for evil. But it's also a story about the power of resilience of those who stood up to Schmid, who sought justice, and who ultimately refused to let darkness consume them.
And as we wrap up, I'm left with this thought. What would have happened if someone had intervened earlier? Could those girls have been saved? It's a question that haunts many true crime cases.
It does, and it highlights the importance of speaking up, of not being afraid to challenge authority, of trusting our instincts when something feels wrong. Schmid's story. It's a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil thrives in silence, but it's also a testament to the human spirit's ability to overcome even the darkest of times.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We hope it's left you with a better understanding of this complex case and the enduring questions it raises.
And as always, we encourage you to continue researching, to delve deeper into the complexities of this story, and to draw your own conclusions.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.